Hi everyone. It's been such a fun day coming home to Brisbane and reconnecting with everyone. I've been outside of the design industry for more than a decade, and so it's felt really nourishing to reconnect with so many people that I know and ideas and ways of thinking that I love. I think I've been really hungry for it, so thank you so much. As an architect and an artist that entered the criminal legal system and ended up founding the first arts-based alternative to incarceration that ended up helping keep 1,400 young people out of jail and exit the system without a criminal record, I sometimes was seen by the system as a little new agey and sometimes totally otherworldly. And it ended up in some interesting sound bites inside the media. So this is a New York Times article about one of our first programs, and this is the quote that I got. Rachel Barnard, an Australian architect who founded Young New Yorkers, says she is trying to pour beauty into the criminal justice system, which is absolutely true, what I was saying, but I didn't say that formally inside my interview. I said it as an aside to somebody else, and the journalist overheard it. And of course, it led to a very funny perception of who I was. This is a project inside the Department of Probation. I was really fortunate to win the New York City Public Artist in Residence program. There was a documentary made, and then I won't talk about this project at length, but this was the quote in the documentary. I believe that sparkle is very underused in social justice. So clearly connecting across fields and sparking new ideas does work, but it also can be perceived in a funny way. So Young New Yorkers was imagined and delivered as a transformative justice program. And it's just interesting to think about what you think transformative justice means to you. Do you think that it means transforming young people's lives? Do you think it means transforming the way that people are inside the system? Or do you think it means transforming the system itself? And at Young New Yorkers, we were really we in transforming the system itself. When we began more than a decade ago, we were very much in the era of mass incarceration. There'd been 30 years of tough-on-crime political rhetoric, which led to horrific policies, including criminalising young people for what is developmentally appropriate behaviour. 1 in 3 African-American men could expect to be incarcerated in their lifetime. 5% of the world's population is in the US, yet 25% of the incarcerated population is in the US. Young people as young as 16 in New York were criminalised as adults, meaning that they could be incarcerated in adult jails, oftentimes for very minor infractions like graffiti, which could get you in there for a year. And then you would be left with a lifelong adult criminal record, which meant that you would not have access to some jobs, you would not have access to scholarships around education or social services like housing. Of course, like most oppressions, in fact, all oppressions, this falls along racial lines. In New York State in 2015, a few years into our project, about 33%, or 35, I'm not great at numbers and I lost my piece of paper, but in the 30s, 16 and 17-year-olds, 30% of them were Black or Latinx. They accounted for 75% of arrests, and what is completely devastating, of those 75% of the people arrested, 95% were Black and Latinx who we chose to incarcerate. And I think we know that we do not send our own children to adult jails. And I think it represents an incredibly violent break in the imagination of who is young and who is not, who is a child, who is not, and how we're imagining kids out there on the periphery of our cities. At the time that we founded, Stop and Frisk in New York City was in its heyday. This was Mayor Bloomberg. I had a conversation with someone about Mayor Bloomberg, and I almost peeled my skin off last night. But young people and people in general were regularly stopped and frisked to see if they were carrying a weapon. This happened predominantly in black and brown and poor neighbourhoods. This did not happen in white neighbourhoods, and a few years after this, the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court, struck it down as an abuse of human rights, which clearly it was. But imagine being 16 and regularly stopped. Perhaps you recognise the police officer who is frisking you repeatedly as you go about the course of your day, and the sense of injustice you have. When we are teenagers, we're wired to physiologically feel injustice. That's why we send young people to jail. They don't think to war. They don't think ahead. They want adventure, and if you can convince them that there's an injustice, they will take action and follow through. So if you retaliate against a police officer because you're clearly being treated in an unfair way, then you can be arrested for resisting arrest, and then you have potentially a lifelong criminal record, and your possibilities are narrowing and narrowing and narrowing. Oh, that was it. And it's just really important to understand that why we see these as structural issues, as failings of us as a community and a culture, these ideas do get internalized into our young people. At the beginning of every long-form program at Young New Yorkers, we would do this language exercise where we would share the words that had actually been used to describe us in our everyday life, and then once we'd become involved with the criminal legal system. And, you know, being called that kid means like basically you're that kid, that bad kid, and you're excluded socially from aspirational expectations or from communities in general. And so they got to rewrite the language that was going to be used to describe them inside the Young New Yorkers community. And this was a fantastic tool also if anyone ever forgot that they were hardworking, visionary, or determined. I could just gently remind them in week 3 of who they were, and it would be very funny, and it's a lovely way to hold a very high standard inside of a classroom. So I won't talk too much about founding Young New Yorkers because Paul did that really beautifully, and I don't want to take up too much time, but so I'll skip it. Oh, no, I won't, because there's slides. So I started out working as an architect in New York City, and in my spare time I went around the city doing public art projects. I, 1 year, went around with a head cam on my head and smiled at people and collected data on how people responded in different neighbourhoods. This is my friends and I doing a project called Intersection, which filmed and like visually connected different neighbourhoods inside New York City. And then I was fortunate enough just after the recession to be able to attend Columbia University, and I attended with the explicit intention of not doing architecture, even though I was doing an architecture program. It was a fantastic year. I loved it. And I was fortunate to win the Goodman Fellowship that Paul explained, and that led to a year that I called the Nothing Times. I did 2 things. I worked for a very posh and fancy art restorer part-time, and then I met with everyone I could about working with young people in Brooklyn. And we would have incredible conversations every 3 weeks with community workers, public defenders, courtroom professionals, designers and artists. And yet every month, every 3 weeks, there was nothing being achieved in reality, and very understandably, a lot of people dropped out of the project at this time because nothing was happening. But several things happened. First, Lisa Schreibersdorf, the executive director of the largest public defense firm in New York City, said yes, she would support what was still being framed as a public art project to provide a platform for young people to advocate for change rather than being an actual change. And then Chief Judge Littman said he was going to raise the age of criminal responsibility from 16 to 18. That meant that the courtrooms were all of a sudden primed to politically want to be treating 16 and 17-year-olds differently, sentencing them differently, court parts opened up inside the adult criminal court just for teenagers. And there's 3 public defenders in this photograph, and they kept saying this should be court mandated. This should not just be a public art project. This should be court mandated. And so they snuck me into court, past the security guards, which they were friends with, and I approached Judge Gabay. You can see he's back here while he was setting up his bench. I told him I had funding from Columbia University. I did not mention it was from the architecture school, and I pitched it as a mandated project, and he said yes on the spot. They then said, okay, we'll do this next year, and I said, actually, my visa runs out in 3 months. We need to start in 4 weeks. And so it's such a testament to how much they were looking for something, for an answer, that a very slow multi-agency team actually pulled off mandating 8 extraordinary young people to our first program. And there's Judge Gabay in subsequent exhibitions in the decade that followed. This is our first program. And I'll talk about this slide, which is, even though we were a court-mandated program now, and we really, a social worker, 2 community workers, and I designed the hell out of that program so that it was empowering and met the court mandate, I insisted that it still be a public art project. So the last session of that program was, what's a social justice issue that's important to you? What public art project would you create to create the reality you want instead of the one that is? And Sachin really wanted people in his neighbourhood to remember that they had possibilities and dreams, and we'd talked about collective memory, the power of spectacle, and he said that thousands of Brooklyn people should walk on New Year's Day to the Brooklyn Bridge, write their dreams down on a paper aeroplane, and on the count of 3, throw it off the bridge to create a public spectacle and to continue the conversation over the year, what was your paper aeroplane dream? And because it was very simple to realise, I thought, okay, let's just do that one at the exhibition as an add-on. And I watched Sachin go up to prosecutors, probation officers, multiple judges, the prosecutor that tried him and his case. And it was remarkable. They all filled out their dreams. I watched parents and judges start laughing together. And inside a courtroom, you are so separated. This is kind of the moment when I realized that we were onto something, and we went from a one-off project to the DA's office, the defense attorneys, the judges asking us to become an organization. And we began to work from the thesis that the US can end mass incarceration with the discretionary power that already exists at each point of contact a young person may have with the criminal legal system. At an arrest, who gets a warning? Who gets a DAT? They don't have to wait underneath the courtroom. Who gets handcuffed and held in an adult cell for 36 hours waiting to see a judge from moving from one train carriage to the other? I'm sorry, I have so many slides and I don't know what to talk about, but what I will say is that Judge Grasso was former NYPD, and I was thrilled that he was the second judge that we partnered with because he was considered to be conservative inside the system, and so he brought so many people across the line to decentering incarceration and bringing back the humane restorative responses that used to be normal for receiving young people that had made mistakes. And so desk appearance tickets mean that the police officer has decided that you don't have to go underneath the courthouse into a putrid cell for 36 hours, that you can just be trusted to show up to your court date. But it still often meant that you were in the system for a year or 2 years or more, that you had to miss school to show up to your court dates to get this cleared. And Judge Grasso set it up so that they would appear at their court date in the morning, walk across the corridor and have a program with my team in the afternoon, and then get their case dismissed and sealed. No adult criminal record, not months and months, years and years being stuck inside the system. Not having to wrangle a teenager to turn up to something that they don't want to go to, which is a mammoth effort in and of itself. This is when we realised that having the young people who usually stand silently by the prosecutor, by their defence attorney as a plea deal is made, that they can't advocate for themselves other than being perhaps the social worker has written a really awful story about their life to kind of build compassion, but in creating these self-portraits and hosting them in the courtroom, oftentimes with words like family, leadership and love underneath them, it really reframed who these young people could be and who they were. That's just me showing you that while I was loving, I was also fierce. This is a project in Brownsville around gun violence. It's the highest rate of gun violence in New York City, and these young people created a wall that said trust out of roses and then had people write love letters to Brownsville. That's the head of probation. Judge Grasso came from the one-day program on our invitation. And the NYPD, who the kids really wanted to come because for them, gun violence was very close to police brutality and the lack of trust between young people and the police. And they declined our invitation, but Judge Grasso went across the street, and this is Inspector Gallotta coming over, and that formed a 10-year relationship with one of the most prolific, shall we say, police precincts. This idea, as we just started to develop a kind of, I don't want to say aesthetic, that's very flattening, but young people started to be inspired by each other's public art installations, and this happened with this group much later in 2017. This project was not called Love Letters to Brownsville, it was called Unity. And they were squarely focused on police brutality as the issue that they wanted to address. They created this garden party and they invited people to reimagine policing and had everybody that attended write down what they wanted policing to look like or safety to look like. Many people wanted to abolish the police completely. And so they would write their vision on a flower, but then they would recreate the police badge so that in wanting unity, wanting every human to belong together inside of New York City instead of having these stark barriers, they also wanted to celebrate what each person was bringing to unity. So they had that each person elect onto their reimagined police badge the characteristics they brought. And I can't read that from open-mindedness and positivity in this person's case. And then here is the head prosecutor of the Kings County for the youth part, receiving a rose and totally reconfiguring her relationship with the young people in her court part, and the NYPD officers who attended and listened to the young people's experience. Judge Gabay, again, our first judge to say yes. And the lengthy conversations that happened at this exhibition. And I just like this shot because it's a police holster with the rose added. And this is the extraordinary group of people, young people that delivered this exhibition. The Wisdom Gift Exchange was an all-women's class. In 2017, there was a spike in assault cases amongst young women, and They were really interested in who got to learn from their mistakes and who doesn't, who gets punished for their mistakes, traumatized, and who gets a lifelong criminal record, who has their possibilities narrowed because of their mistakes. And so they formulated this idea, this exhibition of the Wisdom Gift Exchange. They invited, this is really funny because we couldn't put anything on the walls of the Eastern District Court, so we literally spent hours hanging this gift room from like hundreds of silver helium balloons, and I think like I almost severed my fingers doing that. But they had the criminal court actors write down, confess a big mistake that they'd made in their life on the wisdom disc, what they'd learnt from that mistake, and the wisdom they had to offer other people because they had made that mistake. And then they went to the bench where one of the graduates was sitting, and they read the mistake. So their mistake was being judged by a young person, and they got certified to be wise. They then gift wrapped their wisdom gift, and at the end, as you left, you got to take somebody else's wisdom. And I thought it was a really beautiful reframing of what might have you get arrested and who's getting arrested. I'm going to skip through this one because I've got 6 minutes. It's really hard to skip through them because I want to tell you about how so many people don't have their physical and safety needs met at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy, but it's not visible. And this is Amber, who's actually a graduate of the next exhibition I'm going to show you, but this is just such a great photo of her. She said, "They made me see I'm not a criminal. I'm a young woman who is still making mistakes, learning and growing." So much of our work inside of the programs was not about behavior change or restorative action. They're already extraordinary young people. They have a depth of wisdom that is so profound, and they are so generous with it and with each other. What a lot of our work is discussing, processing, bringing awareness to the trauma of an arrest and what we had made that mean about ourselves. So this is the courtroom spectacular, again in the Eastern District Court. This is Shaunti, a grad who became a program teacher with us. Okay, that's the head of that's a judge that's the head of the Eastern District Court, having to do a quiz that Hector, who was 17 at the time, and the quiz is called, this group was really interested in when do you develop cognitive consequential thinking, which is 25 for most people. So why are you getting an adult criminal record that lasts forever when in most countries arrests drop markedly once people turn 25? 25 plus, there's hardly any arrests. So they put this quiz, how old are you when you develop consequential thinking? How young are you when you're treated as an adult in New York? How long do you think a criminal record lasts? What do you think the impact is? And the people had to do this on the back of a quiz that represented their brain stage. So a lot of the senior judges are over 70, and they had to declare and wear around their neck that they had a senior brain, and all the adolescent brains running around the place was made extra visible with this pendant. And if you did well on the quiz, the young people gave you stars to reward you, and obviously the adults just loved that, like kids would. Reconfiguring the power dynamic spatially of the courtroom. In our exhibitions inside courtrooms, only the young people ever stood and spoke from the judge's bench. And this is Judge Calabrese, one of our most supportive judges, just looking pleased as punch to be not up there on the bench. And he developed long-term friendships. He's shaking hands with Daniel, who was our very first graduate, who continued to support our programs for the 10 years that I led the organisation. So he was with us for 10 years. 2 minutes and 53 seconds. This group of young people, this is the judges reading about the kids' experience inside the courtroom, and so you can see how distraught they are because they've never understood the experience from a young person's perspective until they read their, this was a meditative essay exercise we did inside the class. But this group of young people, more than half of them genuinely wanted to become tattoo artists. So we ended up going on an excursion because I ran a silent art auction. Most of the art was by graffiti artists and street artists because so many of them had been arrested and wanted to support this program. I knew one of the most famous underground tattoo artists in New York, and so we all went there. They all thought I was very cool. But in their exhibition, once you'd done your brain science quiz and a few other activities, you came to the backside of the exhibition and you had to write your aspirations for New York on this Brainiac card and then take it to the tattoo booth. And the young person that was graduating would read your vision, interpret an acknowledgement for you, and tattoo that acknowledgement onto your hand. And you can just see that the way that bodies are touching is so different to the way it happens inside an arrest and in the courtroom. The young people are leading that interaction. So here we have some of our tattoo artists tattooing different criminal legal professionals. I love this picture because Chino is one of the most famous old school graffiti artists in New York City. Fulton Mall, which is the most famous mall in Brooklyn, used to be called Chino's Place because his tag was everywhere, and he still does sticker tags. I see him all over Brooklyn. And he's tattooing the director of Brooklyn Justice Initiatives. And then everybody's visions were tied to are they hydrangeas, those flowers? Hydrangeas, because the kids thought that they looked like brains. And then again, you got this gift. And so artifacts and something to take home to remember the experience so that it was in your home, again, creating more intimacy so that perhaps you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and think, my God, what are we doing to these extraordinary young people? Became a really big repeat factor for us. We did dozens and dozens of these exhibitions. All of them were extraordinary. I wish I could tell you all the themes. So we were at 0, and I'm just going to go for 2 more minutes. I apologize. We're at 0 time. But at the end of my 10 years leading Young New Yorkers, we were in COVID, and the Manhattan DA was up for election. And so we wrote to each candidate and invited them to join a DA forum that would be moderated by young people who had been arrested and through our program. And so I'm very proud of this, over the course of 10 years, young people went from being silent and not understanding what the hell was going on inside the courtroom and desperately trying to figure out if they had a record or what they needed to do in the corridor outside the courtroom, were asking the questions in one of the most popular DA forums of that election. This is Kamani and I. Kamani is from Love Letters to Brownsville. So 2013, he stayed with us that whole time, opening the DA debate. And this is Anastasia, who was homeless and hadn't eaten for 2 days. She is also incredibly committed to eco-justice and how that intersects with race and social justice. And so she wanted to eat good food. And so she was arrested for stealing groceries from a Whole Foods store. And here she is asking the candidates, she was held in arraignment, she was vomiting from hunger, and she was forced to eat white bread that was half frozen as a meal. You guys call this crimes of poverty, but in reality, what are you going to do about this? Do you think I should have, as a teenager, been incarcerated for stealing food? And I just love the looks on the candidates' faces of having to answer to the people most impacted by the criminal legal system. And then at the end of a decade, it was time to step down. It was the most magnificent decade of my life, without question. Every day I knew I was alive for a reason. I had so much purpose. My community was so diverse, so loving, so challenging, but it was also, I can't remember what a word for worst that starts with M that would form a rhyme with magnificent is, miserable. It was also the most miserable decade. I worked so hard. I got shingles and Bell's palsy, which are viruses triggered by stress. We had grown from a one-off project to an organisation with $1 million budget, lots of city funding, in high demand, and it was time for a leader who represented the young people that we serve. It was an incredibly difficult moment when I realised it was time for me to step down. I honestly just realised I had to do it as I was walking through my railroad apartment, completely exhausted. All of these different factors just kind of clicked in my mind, and I realised it was time to step down. It was a very difficult moment, but when I wrote to the judges, the judges that helped us found our organisation, and I took out their names, but they wrote back and said, I think I speak on behalf of Judge such and such and Judge such and such when I say that you have inspired us to be better judges, and for that we will be ever grateful. And my mum's in the audience today because I'm back home in Brisbane, and so I wrote back to them and said, thank you, I just sent that to my mum and I'm pretty sure she's going to cry. And so they wrote an email especially to my mum. Your daughter Rachel showed us and so many other judges and lawyers that when given the right opportunity and support, many young people, often not given a real chance in life, can change their lives and do amazing things for their community. Not only has she made a difference in each person who participated in her program, but changed the mindset forever of many judges and lawyers, thereby giving opportunities to young people for years to come. And so in my little piece of the world in Brooklyn and Lower Manhattan where we worked, we went from this violent imagination around who young people were that were coming into the courtroom to judges actually acknowledging that they had grown and developed because of their interactions with the young people and deeply listening to them and deeply seeing them for their potential. And I can tell you a million stories about the young people, but that there was a culture shift inside of the system, and that we did change the discretionary patterns that the young people and the Young New Yorkers team is probably my deepest held honour and achievement. So thank you so much.